Oak Creek, Wyoming. Winter, 1873. Snow driving sideways, wind sharp enough to cut bone, and a tall stranger just locked his hand around the corrupt mayor's wrist like it was nothing. She's not your property to price. The young mother pulled her 3-year-old daughter tight against her chest. Eyes red, jaw set, not one step back. "We have nowhere to sleep, Mommy," the little girl whispered. The cowboy looked down at them both. Gray eyes cold as the storm outside, but his voice was warmer than any roof they'd slept under in months. Crossed Pines always has a warm hearth for folks who need a home. If you want to know where this road leads, keep watching. The train hissed to a stop, like it was tired of carrying them. Genevieve Thorne stepped onto the platform at Oak Creek with her daughter on her hip and 1.8 in her coat pocket. That was everything. That was the whole sum of her new life out west. The wind hit her immediately. A mean, searching wind that slipped through the thin cotton of her summer dress like she wasn't wearing anything at all. She'd left Philadelphia in August. She hadn't thought about Wyoming winters. She hadn't had time to think about much of anything except getting out. Cora buried her face against Evie's neck. "Almost there, baby," Evie murmured. Almost. The depot was barely a building. A lantern swung on a rusted hook above the door, throwing orange light across the platform in uneven strokes. Snow was falling sideways. A few townspeople stood around with their collars turned up, waiting on mail or freight, not paying much attention to a woman, and a small child stepping off the train into a blizzard. Evie looked around for Mr. Aldred. He was supposed to be here. The broker in Philadelphia had been very specific. Aldred Matching Services, he'd told her, placing a pamphlet on his desk with all the official confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything. Your passage, your match, and your new beginning. Guaranteed. She'd paid him $40 she didn't have. Borrowed it from the seamstress downstairs before Julian's family could freeze that account too. She spotted a man in a brown suit near the freight office, heavyset, with a ledger tucked under one arm and the particular expression of someone who had been waiting just long enough to be annoyed. "Mr. Aldred?" she called out. He turned, looked at her, then down at Cora, then back at her. Something shifted in his face. "Mrs. Thorne." He didn't move toward her. "There's been a development." She walked to him anyway, shifting Cora higher on her hip. "What kind of development?" He flipped open his ledger like he was checking the weather. "Your match has withdrawn." Circumstances changed on his end. These things happen. The wind pushed hard against her back. "These things happen," she repeated. "The passage debt still stands, of course." He closed the ledger. $42 with the handling fee. "Since you can't pay it tonight, I've arranged for you to settle it through employment." He nodded somewhere over her shoulder. "Mayor Vance has a position available. You'll be—" "I'm not interested in the mayor's position, Mrs. Thorne." His voice dropped, patient and firm the way men got when they thought they were being reasonable. "You don't have a choice. The agreement was clear. You default, you work it off. That's the contract." "The contract was for a match. You didn't provide one." He didn't answer that. He just stepped back, and a larger shadow moved in to fill the space he'd left. Mayor Montgomery Vance was a wide man. Not tall but wide, in the way that took up more room than seemed fair. He wore a beaver fur coat and a gold watch chain, and the easy smile of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Miss Thorne." His voice was thick and warm, like gravy left on the stove too long. "Welcome to Oak Creek. Sorry about your arrangements falling through. These brokers." He shook his head. "Unreliable bunch, but you don't need to worry. I've got room at my establishment for a capable woman. Clean work, decent tips." Evie had grown up in a house with men like this. She knew exactly what decent tips meant. "No, thank you," she said. Vance's smile didn't move. "It's not really optional, sweetheart. You've got passage debt, no money, no husband, and no place to stay tonight." He gestured at the snow around them. "It's 11 degrees and dropping. You want to stand here and be difficult, or do you want a warm room?" Cora's fingers tightened in Evie's hair. Evie kept her voice level. I'll find other work. I'll pay the debt properly. But I won't work in a saloon. Vance's smile finally shifted then. Just slightly. It got smaller and more specific. You don't seem to understand how this town works. He reached out and closed his hand around her arm just above the elbow. She didn't flinch. She'd learned not to flinch. But Cora felt it, the way children always do, felt the sudden tension move through her mother's body, and she started to cry. Not a loud cry. Cora rarely cried loudly anymore. It was small and exhausted, the cry of a child who had run out of the energy to be frightened properly. We have nowhere to sleep, Mommy. 3 words, 3 years old. Vance laughed at that, a short, satisfied sound, and pulled Evie a step toward the door. Then a hand came out of the dark and closed around Vance's wrist. A large hand. Steady. It didn't squeeze or jerk, it just stopped him, completely and without effort, the way you'd stop a door from closing. Let go of her arm. The voice was quiet. That was the first thing Evie noticed. Not loud, not theatrical. Just quiet and entirely certain, the way a man sounds when he has nothing left to prove to anyone. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the lantern light, snow on the shoulders of his dark canvas coat and on the brim of his hat. Tall, broad, gray eyes that caught the light and didn't give much back. A jaw that looked like it had been made with a straight rule. He was holding Vance's wrist, like it was something he'd picked up off the ground. Vance went very still. Cross, he said the name carefully. This is a private business matter. Business? Gideon Cross looked at Evie, then at Cora, still crying softly against her mother's shoulder. Then back at Vance. That's what you're calling it. She's got a debt. I'm collecting. She doesn't owe you anything. His grip didn't loosen. She had a contract with a broker who didn't deliver. That's not a debt, Gator. That's fraud, and you know it. Vance's jaw tightened. You're not the law. No. Gideon released his wrist. He took one step back, putting himself between Vance and Evie without making a production of it. But the Federal Circuit comes through here in 6, and I've got a good memory. The 2 men looked at each other. Vance adjusted his coat. The smile came back. Thinner this time. This isn't finished. It is for tonight. Vance held his gaze for another moment. Then he turned, and the snow swallowed him up. Aldred had already gone. Evie realized she was shaking. Not from cold, though it was cold. From the particular kind of release that comes after. You've been holding your whole body rigid for a very long time. She looked at the man standing in front of her. He didn't look at her with pity. That was the thing that caught her off guard. No pity, no calculation, none of the soft, greedy interest she'd learned to recognize in men who did favors and then explained the terms later. He just looked at her like a person who had a problem that needed solving. I have a ranch about 4 miles out, he said. Crossed Pines. I came in for winter supplies. A pause. You're welcome to come with me, both of you. Tonight. Evie didn't move. Why? He considered that like it was a fair question, because it's 11 degrees and your little girl is crying, and human beings aren't commodities. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat against the wind. There's a warm hearth. A room with a lock on the door. Nothing more than that. She studied his face, looking for the lie. She was very good at finding lies by now. She didn't find one. Cora had stopped crying. She was looking at the tall man with the snow on his hat, and she had gone very quiet in that watchful way she had. Not afraid, exactly, considering. The wind drove a wall of snow across the platform. Evie made up her mind. My name is Genevieve Thorne, she said. This is Cora. He nodded once. Gideon Cross. I'll work for my keep. We'll talk about that tomorrow. He turned toward the freight wagon, tied at the far end of the platform. Come on. Let's get her out of the cold. Evie followed him through the dark and the snow. Cora's small weight warm against her chest, the lantern light falling away behind them. She didn't know what waited for her at Crossed Pines. She knew what waited for her if she stayed. She walked. The wagon ride took 40 minutes. Evie sat in the back with Cora tucked under her arm and a horse blanket pulled around both of them. Gideon had put it there without asking. Just lifted it from behind the seat and set it down beside her before climbing up front. He didn't say anything about it. He just drove. The road out of Oak Creek was rough and dark. Pines pressed in close on both sides, heavy with snow. The only sounds were the horses breathing and the creak of the wagon wheels and the wind moving through the trees above them. Cora fell asleep somewhere in the first mile. Evie did not sleep. She sat with her daughter's head against her ribs and watched the back of Gideon Cross's shoulders and tried to figure out what kind of man she was dealing with. He hadn't spoken since they left the depot. He wasn't performing silence the way some men did, making it obvious so you'd ask him to break it. He was just quiet. Like quiet was his natural condition, and he saw no reason to disturb it. She'd known men who were quiet because they were planning something. She'd known men who were quiet because they thought it made them interesting. She didn't yet know which kind this was. She was still thinking about it when the wagon came around a bend in the road, and she saw crossed pines for the first time. It wasn't grand. It didn't try to be. A long, low house built from dark timber, solid and squared off against the snow. Warm light in 2 windows. A barn to the left, a smaller outbuilding beyond that. A fence line running into the dark. Everything about it said built to last rather than built to impress. An old man came out of the house as they pulled up. Dark skin weathered by years of wind and sun, a gray beard, a lantern held up in one hand. "Figured you'd be late," he said. Not a complaint, just a fact. Had a situation in town. Gideon climbed down from the wagon. "Ben, this is Mrs. Thorne and her daughter Cora. They'll be staying tonight." Old Ben raised the lantern and looked at Evie with a calm, unhurried gaze. Whatever he thought, he kept it to himself. "Stew's still hot," he said. Inside was warm. Genuinely warm, the kind that reaches your bones slowly, so you don't realize how cold you were until the heat starts to undo it. A stone fireplace took up most of the far wall in the main room. A long table, a braided rug, shelves of books and tools and things in no particular order. It was a working house. Nobody had fussed over it. Ben set a bowl of stew in front of Cora at the table and crouched down to her level without any fanfare. He didn't try to talk to her or charm her. He just pushed the bowl a little closer and said, "Careful, it's warm." Cora looked at the bowl, then at him. Then she picked up the spoon. Evie watched her daughter eat and felt something she hadn't felt in months. She didn't have a clean word for it. Relief, maybe. Or just the absence of immediate danger, which had started to feel like the same thing. Gideon had been moving around the far side of the room, and now he came to stand near the hallway. "I'll show you the room," he said. It was small and plainly furnished. A bed with a thick quilt, a nightstand, a wooden chair. But the fireplace in the corner was already going, banked high, and the room was warmer than anything Evie had slept in since summer. Someone had put a folded blanket on the chair. Gideon stopped in the doorway. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a key, a plain iron key on a short ring. He held it out to her. Evie looked at it. "It locks from the inside," he said, "and from the outside, if you want to take Cora somewhere and secure the room. The key is yours to keep." She took it from his hand. Their fingers didn't touch. "I want to be clear about something," he said. He wasn't leaning against the doorframe or making himself comfortable. He was standing straight, giving her room. "I'm not doing this to collect on it later. You don't owe me anything for tonight. But if you want to stay past tomorrow, I'm short a housekeeper. The woman who kept this place left in September to go back east." A pause. "It's honest work. Weekly wage, paid on time. Your freedom is yours to keep. You make your own choices. That's the arrangement." Evie turned the key over in her palm. "Why are you telling me all this right now?" "Because you've been watching me sideways since the depot," he said, "trying to find what I want from you. I'd rather just tell you than make you spend energy figuring it out." She looked at him then, really looked. He was handsome in a stark, unadorned way. Strong jaw, straight nose, gray eyes that were hard to read. But there was something behind them that wasn't hard at all. Something worn down and heavy, like a man carrying a piece of weight he'd gotten used to, but never gotten comfortable with. All right, she said. He nodded. Good night, Mrs. Thorne. He pulled the door closed behind him. Evie stood alone in the warm room for a long moment. Then she crossed to the door and turned the key in the lock. She stood there with her hand, still on it, listening to the silence on the other side. Then she went to get Cora. She woke up twice in the night. Both times she lay still and listened and heard nothing alarming. Just wind, just the fire settling. Cora was breathing slow, and even beside her, curled up small, one fist tucked under her chin. The second time Evie woke, she heard something else, faint, from somewhere down the hall. A man's voice, low and broken. Not words, just sound. Like something escaping that he would have preferred to keep in. Then silence again. She lay in the dark, thinking about the weight she'd seen in his eyes. In the morning, she found out that Gideon Cross had been up since before dawn, loading the winter supplies he'd collected the night before into the barn storage. He came in for breakfast without explaining where he'd been, and he ate without ceremony, and he said very little. But he poured coffee for Ben before he poured any for himself. Evie noticed that. She noticed most things. It was a habit she'd developed for survival. She told him she would take the job. He said good, and that was that. She spent the rest of the day learning the house. She was good at learning houses, good at finding where things were kept, and what needed doing, and how a household breathed. By evening, she had reorganized the kitchen shelf, located the source of the draft coming under the back door, and identified 4 separate spots where the roof was going to cause problems if the snow kept piling up. Ben watched all of this without comment, but at supper he passed her the bread before she had to ask for it, which she suspected meant she'd passed some kind of test. She was careful not to be alone with Gideon in any closed room, not because he had done anything to warrant it, purely because she needed time, and she didn't trust her own instincts yet. Her instincts had been wrong before. She had married Julian Thorne because he had seemed solid and decent, and it had taken 2 years to understand fully what he actually was. She wasn't going to rush judgment in either direction. She was just going to watch and work and give herself time to think clearly. That was the plan. What she hadn't planned for was waking before dawn on the third morning and walking to the kitchen for water and finding Gideon sitting at the table with his face in his hands. He heard her footstep and straightened immediately. His expression closed off quickly and practiced. Sorry, she said. I didn't mean to. It's fine. His voice was even. Go ahead. She got her water. She turned to go back to her room. My unit, he said. She stopped. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table. Lost 11 men at Millbrook Creek in '63. I gave the order to pull back. Command disputed it later, called it insubordination. He was quiet for a moment. I know it was the right call. Doesn't make them any less gone. She stood in the kitchen doorway. I'm sorry, she said, not because she had anything to apologize for, because it was true. He nodded once, still not looking at her. She went back to her room. She lay awake for a long time after, staring at the ceiling, turning the key over and over in her hand in the dark. 2 people in a house, she thought, both of them carrying something heavy. Both of them very careful about where they put it down. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. She put the key on the nightstand and closed her eyes and waited for morning. December settled over, crossed pines, like it meant to stay a while. Evie had been there 11 days when she finally felt like she understood the shape of the place. Not just the house, but the whole property, the rhythm of it, who did what, and when, and why. Gideon was out before sunrise most mornings. He and Lassiter, the ranch hand, who communicated mostly through pointing and nods, handled the horses and the fence lines and whatever else a working ranch required in winter. Ben managed the food stores and the fire, and moved through the house with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and saw no need to hurry. Evie had carved out her own place in that rhythm. She cooked breakfast and supper, kept the house clean and organized, and had spent the last 4 days working her way through the ranch ledgers, which were in a state that could only be described as organized chaos. Gideon clearly understood cattle and horses. He did not understand columns. She was good with numbers. She'd kept Julian's household accounts for 2 years. Before he'd taken that over too, along with everything else. She found errors going back 8 months. She corrected them without being asked. In the evenings, after supper, she taught Cora her letters at the kitchen table, A through M so far. Cora learned carefully, tracing each letter with her finger before committing it to the slate, and she almost never spoke during these lessons, but she paid close attention to everything. She paid close attention to everything. It was on a cold Tuesday morning that Evie looked up from the ledger to find that Cora was no longer sitting on the rug in the corner, where she'd been playing with a wooden horse that Ben had given her. Evie was up and moving before she finished the thought. She found her outside. Cora had wandered through the back door, which Evie had left slightly open to let out the wood smoke, and was now standing in the snow near the fence at the edge of the paddock. She was wearing her boots and her coat, which she had put on herself, though the buttons were wrong. Gideon's warhorse, Dolly, had come to the fence. Dolly was not a gentle horse by reputation. She was a chestnut mare with a white blaze and an independent streak that Lassiter treated with visible respect. She'd carried Gideon through 2 years of cavalry service, and she remembered it. She did not much like strangers reaching for her face. Cora had both hands flat against the fence rail, just looking at the horse, not reaching, not making noise, just looking. Dolly was looking back. Evie stopped where she was. She didn't call out. She heard footsteps behind her. Gideon, coming up from the barn, he stopped, too, when he saw what was in front of him. He stood beside Evie, and neither of them said anything. After a moment, Gideon moved. Not fast. Nothing about this man was fast unless it had to be. He walked to the fence slowly, his boots quiet in the snow, and crouched down beside Cora so he was at her level. Cora looked at him. She didn't move away. He held out his own hand to Dolly first, letting the horse read him. Then he gently took Cora's small hand in his and lifted it, just slightly, not pushing it toward the horse, just holding it in position, letting Dolly choose. Dolly leaned forward and pressed her nose into Cora's palm. Cora's whole face changed. She laughed. It was bright and sudden and completely unguarded. A child's laugh with nothing complicated in it, and it rang out across the snow and the gray December sky and disappeared into the pines. Evie put her hand over her mouth. She had not heard that sound in 7 months. Not since, before the lawyers, before the warrants, before the night Julian had screamed at her in their front hallway with their daughter standing at the top of the stairs listening. Cora had gone quiet after that night, in the careful, deliberate way that children go quiet when they've learned that sound attracts danger. Evie had missed that laugh so much. She hadn't been able to think about it directly. Gideon looked over his shoulder at her. She couldn't do anything about the expression on her face. She'd given up trying. He turned back to Cora. He didn't make anything of the moment. He just let the horse nuzzle the little girl's hand and said quietly, "Her name's Dolly. She's particular about who she likes." A pause. "Looks like she likes you." Cora looked at him very seriously. "Does she like you most days?" he said. "Some days. She's still making up her mind." Cora considered this. "Me too," she said. He laughed at that. Short and genuine, surprised out of him. It was the first time Evie had heard him laugh at anything. She looked away, back at the tree line, and breathed. It was 3 days after that when it happened. Evie was reorganizing the shelf in the hallway, moving a stack of old correspondence to make room for the winter medical supplies she'd sorted out of the kitchen cabinet. She lifted a bundle of papers that had been folded and tucked behind a row of books clearly not meant to be found quickly, and something fell out from between them. She picked it up. It was a document, several pages, court-stamped, official, with the seal of the 3rd District of Pennsylvania, in the matter of custody of Cora Elaine Thorne. Her own name, printed in ink that had been read so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold lines. Gideon's voice came from the doorway. "Found those in your bag the second night," he said, "when I was moving it so Cora could have the bigger side of the bed. I wasn't reading through your things. It fell open." She didn't know what she'd expected him to say. Something defensive, maybe. An explanation that became an excuse. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and waited. "They said I stole her," Evie said. Her voice was flat. She'd gotten good at keeping it that way. "Julian's family, they have a judge in their pocket. 3, probably." She set the papers down on the shelf carefully. "The warrant says I fled with Cora unlawfully, but she's my daughter. She was never his to begin with. He didn't want her until he realized he could use her." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You got any of the original filings? From before the warrant?" "Some, not enough. A lawyer in Philadelphia told me to run west and find a federal circuit. That the Vance family's influence doesn't reach here." "He was right about the first part," Gideon said. "Vance's influence does reach here, but he doesn't own the federal marshals." He looked at her steadily. "We'll figure out the legal side. There are ways to do it that don't involve you running again." "I know I don't," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "A corrupt court's ruling doesn't define your worth as a mother," he said. "Out here in the West, we judge a person by their heart and their hands today." She had heard a lot of words in her life that were meant to make her feel better, words that were really about making the speaker feel generous, feel useful, feel like they'd done something. This wasn't that. He said it plain, the way he said most things, and then he pushed off the doorframe and walked back toward the kitchen, like he hadn't just handed her the first real breath she'd drawn in months. She stood in the hallway with the custody papers on the shelf beside her and listened to him pour himself a cup of coffee through the wall. She looked down at Cora's name on the document. Cora Elaine Thorne, her daughter, her heart. She folded the papers back along their worn lines and put them in her own coat pocket where they belonged and went back to work. It was a Thursday morning when Gator Vance rode up to Crossed Pines. Evie heard the horses first, 2 of them, coming fast up the road from town. She was at the kitchen table working through the last of the ledger corrections, and she looked up before she consciously registered why. Gideon was already at the window. His expression didn't change much, but his shoulders did. A small, almost invisible shift that she'd learned to read over the past 2 weeks. It meant trouble was coming, and he was calculating how to meet it. Vance came through the gate like he owned the property and was just now getting around to inspecting it. He had a deputy with him, young man, nervous around the eyes, with a star pinned to his coat that looked recently polished. The kind of polish that comes from wanting to look more official than you feel. Gideon went to the door and opened it before they knocked. Vance. Cross. The mayor swung down from his horse with the careful dignity of a heavy man trying not to look like one. He surveyed the yard, the barn, the house, taking inventory. "Fine morning." "What do you want?" Vance smiled. "Now that's not very neighborly." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Official business, I'm afraid. Got a warrant here for the arrest of one Genevieve Thorne. Vagrancy. Breach of contract." He paused. "You've been harboring a fugitive, Gideon. That's a serious matter." Gideon took the paper. "Read it." Didn't rush. "This is your signature," he said. "You're the mayor, not a judge. Acting authority. Deputy Hendricks here will confirm it." The young deputy confirmed nothing, just stared at a spot somewhere above the barn door. Inside the house, Evie had stopped moving. She stood in the kitchen doorway, reading the scene through the window. Her hands were steady. Her mind was already moving. She had written the document 2 nights ago. Not because she'd known this was coming exactly. More because she'd understood, from the moment Vance let her walk away at the depot, that he wouldn't let it stay that way. Men like Vance didn't lose track of debts, real or invented. They came to collect. The question was always just when. She had spent those 2 nights at the kitchen table, after Cora was asleep, drafting in careful, Precise language, what she knew about employment law, property rights, and the territorial statutes she'd read in Gideon's copy of the Wyoming Territory Legal Handbook, which she'd found on the shelf between a farrier's manual and a 3-year-old almanac. She picked up the document from the table. She walked outside. Vance saw her coming, and his smile widened, the smile of a man who thought this was about to get easier. She walked past Gideon and stopped in front of Vance directly. "This warrant is fraudulent," she said. She kept her voice clear and level. "The vagrancy charge fails because I am a legally employed resident of this property. The breach of contract charge fails because the original contract was with Aldred Matching Services, who defaulted first by failing to provide the agreed match. I did not breach anything." Vance's smile stayed in place. "And who's going to argue that? In a court, sweetheart, you?" "Yes." She held out her document. "This is a dual employment contract between myself and the owner of Crossed Pines Ranch. It establishes my position, my wage, my right to reside on this property as an independent employee. It also establishes my property rights under the 1869 Territorial Act, which means I am not subject to any male guardianship, implied or otherwise." She let him take it. "I am no man's property. I am a free woman earning my way through honest labor." Vance unfolded the paper. He read it. His smile began to lose some of its confidence. The deputy leaned over and read it too. His eyebrows went up slightly. "This doesn't have a circuit court stamp," Vance said. "It doesn't need one to be legally binding under territorial employment law. But I'd be very glad to present it to the federal circuit when they come through in 6 weeks. She held his gaze. "I've also written a detailed account of the events at the depot 2 weeks ago. The coercion, the fraudulent debt, the attempt to force me into indentured employment. I've dated it and signed it, and old Ben has witnessed it." She paused. "Would you like me to make you a copy?" Vance looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Gideon. Gideon said nothing. He had his arms crossed, and his expression was exactly what it always was, steady and unreadable. But there was something around his eyes that might have been satisfaction. Vance folded the contract and handed it back. "This isn't finished," he said. The same words he'd used at the depot, but they landed differently now, lighter, less certain. "I know," Evie said, "but today it is." Vance gathered his horse and his nervous deputy and rode back out through the gate. Evie stood in the yard until they were gone. Then she let out a slow breath and turned around to find Gideon watching her. "Where'd you learn to write a contract like that?" he asked. "I kept my husband's household accounts and correspondence for 2 years. He had a lawyer. I read everything that came through that office." She looked down at the paper in her hands. "Knowledge is the one thing Julian could never take away. He didn't think to." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He'll come back with something worse," he said. "I know." She folded the contract along its lines. "Then we'll need something better ready." He looked at her for another moment, then nodded once, and went back inside. That afternoon he came to find her in the side yard, where she'd taken Cora to get some air in the pale winter sun. He was carrying his hunting rifle, a long, clean Winchester, well-maintained, the wood stock worn smooth from use. "Come here," he said, not to Cora, to Evie. She walked over. He turned the rifle in his hands. "Can you shoot?" "I've never tried." "Then it's time you learned." He held it out. "Vance isn't going to stop at legal maneuvers. You need to be able to protect yourself and Cora when I'm out on the range. That's not optional anymore." She took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected. "Show me," she said. He spent an hour with her in the far end of the yard away from the house, with a row of fence posts as targets. He showed her how to hold it, how to seat the stock properly against her shoulder, how to breathe before she squeezed. He was patient and precise, correcting her grip without taking over, explaining each adjustment once, and then letting her work it out. She was not good at first. She expected that. By the end of the hour, she had hit 3 out of 7 posts. "Better than most people manage their first time," Gideon said. "I had a good teacher," she said. He picked up the rifle from where she'd lowered it. Same time tomorrow. She went back inside to start supper with her shoulder, already starting to ache from the stock kick, and she thought that ache was one of the better things she'd felt in a long time. That evening, after Cora was in bed, Evie came back to the kitchen for a glass of water and found something new at the table, a small wooden chair, child-sized, square and sturdy, built from the same dark timber as the house, carved into the top rail of the back, in careful, deliberate letters, Cora. She touched the letters with her fingertip. She heard Gideon in the main room, the sound of him banking the fire for the night, and she stood there in the lamplight, with her hand on her daughter's name, carved in good wood, and she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She went to the doorway of the main room. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from the fire. "She ought to have a proper seat at the table," he said. "Simple as that. Good night, Mrs. Thorne." "Good night, Mr. Cross." She went to bed. The second blizzard hit on a Friday. It came faster than old Ben predicted, which was saying something because Ben was rarely wrong about weather. He'd been watching the sky since Wednesday, frowning at the cloud formations over the mountains, the way you frown at a letter you already know contains bad news. By Thursday evening, the wind had picked up. By Friday morning, it was a full whiteout. Gideon and Lassiter had spent the early hours securing what they could. Extra feed to the livestock, barn doors reinforced, the water pump wrapped against freezing. Evie had watched them from the kitchen window while she kept the fire high and made a large pot of everything she could find, because she understood instinctively that this was going to be a long day. By noon, the snow was so heavy it had started to bow the barn roof. She saw it from the window, the way the center ridge had begun to dip. Just slightly, just enough. Gideon saw it too. He was already moving toward the barn before she'd fully registered what was happening. He went in through the main doors to assess the interior bracing. Lassiter was around the back of the property checking on the outbuilding. Evie watched the barn. The wind picked up. She saw the lantern light go on inside, visible through the gap in the barn doors. Gideon, working by lantern light in the dim interior, trying to shore up the central beam. She went back to checking the stew. She was at the stove when she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp sound like a large branch snapping, followed by a low, sustained crack. She turned around. Through the window, she could see a faint orange glow inside the barn that had not been there before. "Ben," she said. He was already at the window. The orange glow was growing. "Lantern must have come off a hook," he said. She was already pulling on her coat. "Gideon's still in there," she said. "Main doors are going to be jammed shut with the snowdrift," Ben said, pulling on his own coat. He was moving fast, faster than she'd seen him move, but his voice stayed level. "There's a side door. Old one, been boarded up since summer. South wall. Is it accessible?" Snow's drifted up against it. "Have to dig." She grabbed the coal shovel from beside the fireplace. Ben took the grain shovel from the mudroom. They went out into the blizzard. The cold was immediate and absolute. The wind pushed against her like a physical thing, trying to send her sideways. She kept her head down and moved toward the barn, following Ben, who moved through the snow with the certainty of someone who had lived on this land for years and knew every inch of it with his eyes closed. The south wall of the barn was on the lee side of the wind, which was the only mercy available. The snowdrift was still 4 feet high against it, but the wind wasn't adding to it as fast. They dug. Her arms burned within 2 minutes. The shovel was heavy, and the snow was heavy, and she was not built for this kind of work. But that was not a relevant consideration. She dug and Ben dug, and she didn't think about anything except moving snow. She could hear the fire now. A low roar under the howling wind. There was a horizontal board across the door. Then another, both nailed in from the outside. She wedged the shovel behind the first one and pulled. The nail held. She repositioned, got better leverage, pulled again, with her full weight behind it. The board came off with a screech of old iron. Ben took the second one. She shoved the door open. The interior of the barn was orange and black, smoke rolling across the ceiling. The north corner fully involved, flame climbing the old timber. The horses were screaming in their stalls, Dolly loudest of all. Gideon was at the center beam with a length of chain wrapped around it, trying to hold the bowing timber in place, and he did not see them because his back was to the door and the smoke was too thick. "Gideon!" she screamed. He turned. She waved at the door. He dropped the chain. He moved toward her. Behind him, the central timber gave a sound like a cannon shot, and the north half of the roof came down in a cascade of snow and burning wood, and the concussion of it knocked her back a step in the doorway. Gideon came through the door at a run, and Ben pulled him clear, and all three of them stumbled away from the wall into the snow and the cold and the clean, brutal air. Evie landed on her knees. For a moment, nobody said anything. There was just the sound of the fire inside, and the wind outside, and the horses, still screaming, still in their stalls. "The horses," Gideon said. He was already getting up. "Lassiter," Ben said, pointing. Lassiter was coming around the far end of the barn, with two of the horses already in hand, their lead lines wrapped around his fists, and he moved toward the pasture fence with the calm efficiency of a man who had run disaster drills before. The remaining horses followed. Gideon stood in the snow and watched the barn burn and breathed. Then he turned and looked at Evie. She was still on her knees in the snow, covered in soot from the open doorway. Her hair had come loose and was plastered across her face. Her hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline and the digging and all of it. He crossed to her in 2 steps and pulled her up and held her there, his arms around her, solid and certain, her face against his chest. She could feel the heat that the fire had put into his coat. She could feel him breathing. She didn't pull away. She just stood. He didn't say anything for a while, just held on. "You dug through that drift," he said finally. Ben helped. Ben's 63 years old. "He's also stronger than me," she said, "so we're both lucky." She felt him exhale, something between a breath and a laugh. She pulled back enough to look at him. There was a streak of soot across his jaw, and his gray eyes were red-rimmed from the smoke, but he was whole, completely and entirely whole. "You knew about the side door," he said. "I read the old floor plans, the ones I cleaned out of the study in the first week." She looked at the burning barn. "I file things away. It's a habit." He looked at her. She'd expected him to say something about being grateful, or something about the close call, the kind of words people reach for when they've just been frightened badly and need to put language around it. He didn't do any of that. He just looked at her, steady and clear, and completely unguarded, for the first time since she'd known him. And what she saw in his face was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. Two people who had each, separately, been carrying everything alone for a very long time. And now, suddenly, undeniably, they were not. The fire crackled. The snow fell. The horses moved safe in the pasture behind them. Ben came to stand beside them both and looked at the barn and said, "Going to need a lot of timber come spring." "Yes," Gideon said. "Good thing you've got good people around you," Ben said. He said it simply, the way he said most things, and he went back inside without waiting for an answer. Evie and Gideon stood in the snow a little longer. Then they went in too. The storm cleared on a Sunday. It left behind a world that looked scrubbed clean, white everywhere, deep and still, with a cold blue sky overhead that had no sympathy in it, the kind of sky that looked beautiful and meant business. Evie was in the yard, hanging the washed blankets over the fence rail, when she heard the horses. More than 2 this time. She counted the sound. 4, maybe 5 animals coming up the road at a steady pace. Organized. Not in a hurry, which was almost worse. She dropped the blanket back in the basket and walked to the gate. Gideon came out of the repaired outbuilding, where he'd been working since dawn. He heard them too. He stopped and stood with a hand braced on the fence post and watched the road. The riders came around the bend, 5 men, a deputy in front. 2 hired guns she didn't recognize, broad and watchful in their saddles. Old Ben appeared at the door of the house, took one look, and went back inside without a word. Lassiter materialized from behind the barn like smoke and stationed himself near the water trough. And behind the deputy, riding side by side like they owned the territory and were just now taking possession of it, were two men Evie knew. The first was Gator Vance. The second was Julian Thorne. The world tilted. She had known, in the abstract, careful way you know things you're not ready to face directly, that Julian would come eventually. She had told herself she was prepared. She had practiced what she would say, how she would stand, how she would keep her face still, and her voice even. She was not prepared. Julian looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, well-dressed even in riding clothes, with the easy, proprietary confidence of a man who had never lost anything he truly wanted to keep. Dark hair, a face that could pass for honest in the right light, and Julian had always known how to find the right light. He saw her at the gate and smiled. The smile she used to think meant something. Evie, he said her name like a man, remarking on a piece of furniture he'd been looking for. You are a difficult woman to find, she said nothing. Gideon stepped up beside her. He looked at Julian, then at Vance, then at the deputy, who was already pulling folded paper from his vest. Warrant of arrest, the deputy said. He had the decency to sound uncomfortable. For Genevieve Thorne. Charge of grand theft. Grand theft, Gideon repeated. Julian swung down from his horse. She fled the state of Pennsylvania with my daughter. Cora is a Thorne by blood. Evie took her without legal sanction. He spread his hands, the picture of a reasonable man being wronged. I'm her father. I have rights. You have a corrupt judge in your pocket, Evie said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. That's not the same thing. Julian's smile stayed in place. The law doesn't distinguish. He looked past her toward the house. Looking for Cora. I'll take my daughter now. Peacefully, if you prefer. You can sort out your legal situation separately. You're not taking her anywhere. Gideon's voice was flat and absolute. Julian looked at him with the particular expression men like Julian, reserved for men they considered beneath them, and had not yet found a reason to fear. And you are? The man whose land you're standing on. Get back on your horse. Vance nudged his horse forward a step. Now cross. Let's be civil. The warrant is legal. The deputy will confirm it. He let that sit. Then conversationally, the way a man mentions the weather, though I wonder if this could all be resolved quietly. Crossed Pines has good water rights. The best in this valley, actually. Springs that don't freeze. He looked around the property. Sign them over and we ride back to town. Evie and the girl are free. Clean and simple. The silence after that was complete. Evie looked at Gideon. He was looking at Vance with the expression of a man making a very careful calculation. Not frightened, not angry, just calculating. Then Julian spoke again. He spoke the way people do when they want maximum damage and have saved the heaviest thing for last. You should know something about your benefactor here, Evie. Julian's voice carried across the yard easily. He wasn't talking to Gideon. He was talking to her. Gideon Cross, formerly of the 6th Union Cavalry, resigned his commission in 1864 under contested circumstances. He tilted his head. My family has considerable interests back east, banks, shipping, military contracts. My uncle did some research when we learned where you'd ended up. A pause. Mr. Cross's unit retreated from Millbrook Creek in June of 1863. 11 men were left behind. One of them was Thomas Aldrich, age 22. The blankets on the fence rail moved in the wind. Evie heard the name. Thomas Aldrich, her brother's name. She turned and looked at Gideon. His face had gone still, completely still, in a way she had not seen before. Not controlled stillness. Just stopped. Your brother, Julian said, watching her. Private Thomas Aldrich, 22nd Pennsylvania Infantry, attached to Cross's cavalry unit, died at Millbrook Creek because his commanding officer ordered a retreat instead of holding the line. That's not what happened, Gideon said. His voice was very quiet. That's what the record says. The record was written by a general covering his own failures. Julian shrugged. One shoulder, elegant and dismissive. Records are records. Courts believe records. He looked at Evie. He's been carrying that guilt for 3 years, Evie. Is that why he took you in? Is that what all of this has been? Some dead man's sister. And he thought he could square the debt? The world had gone very far away. Evie looked at Gideon. She looked at his face. She thought about the journals, the nightmares she'd heard through the wall. She thought about the way he'd told her about Millbrook Creek at the kitchen table. That early morning. 11 men. He'd said 11 men. He hadn't said her brother's name. Had he known who she was from the beginning? Evie. Gideon took a step toward her. She stepped back. The deputy moved forward. The two hired guns spread slightly to the sides. And before anyone could stop it, before Evie could process what was happening, Julian walked past them both toward the house. She heard Cora before she saw her. "Mommy?" Cora had come to the door. She did that sometimes, appeared silently to check where her mother was. She was standing in the doorway in her wool socks and her brown dress, blinking at the men in the yard. Julian reached her in 4 strides. "There she is," he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "No," Evie was running. "Don't you touch her." The deputy caught her arm. She fought him. She was not strong enough. Cora was screaming. It was not the quiet, exhausted cry of the depot. This was full and terrible and loud, a child who understood exactly what was happening. Julian handed her to one of the hired guns, like a package. The man held her firmly, not roughly, but firmly, and walked toward the horses. "Cora!" Evie screamed. Gideon moved. The deputy had a hand on his rifle, and Lassiter was out from behind the trough, and for one moment everything teetered on the edge of becoming something that could not be undone. Vance's voice cut through it. "Sign the water rights over, cowboy." He looked down at Gideon from his horse, composed and satisfied. "Or your woman rots in a cell and the girl is raised in an orphanage. Your call." Cora was in the carriage now. Evie could hear her crying from inside it. Gideon stood in the snow with his hands at his sides. His knuckles had gone white. She could see the tendons standing up in his jaw. The carriage door closed. Evie's legs went. She didn't decide to fall. The mud came up to meet her knees, and she was on the ground in the frozen yard, watching the carriage move toward the gate, watching her daughter's face appear at the small window and then disappear into the fog as the horses picked up speed. She couldn't make a sound. The riders went with it. Julian last not looking back. Vance lingered a moment at the gate. "Think it over, Cross," he said pleasantly. "You know where to find me." Then he was gone too. The yard was empty. Gideon was standing in the snow 10 feet from her, his hands clenched at his sides, blood on his knuckles where he'd pressed them together hard enough to split the skin. He was looking at the road where the carriage had gone. He was not looking at her. She could not look at him. She knelt in the mud and the cold and the silence, and the fog lay over the road where her daughter had disappeared, and she had nothing left to say to anyone. She locked the door. She didn't plan to. She walked in from the yard and down the hall and into her room and turned the key, and then sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on and her boots still muddy from the yard. She sat there for a long time. The house was quiet. She could hear Ben moving in the kitchen, slow and deliberate, the sounds of a man who understood that being useful was the only comfort he could offer right now. She heard Gideon's boots on the porch once, stopping outside her door, staying there for a moment, then moving away. She did not call out to him. She thought about Julian's voice, some dead man's sister, and he thought he could square the debt. She turned it over and looked at it from every angle, the way you do when you're trying to find the place where something stops hurting, and she couldn't find it. Thomas had been 22 when he enlisted, 2 years younger than her. He'd been the kind of boy who brought home stray dogs and argued passionately about things he'd just read and believed completely that the world could be made fair if people simply tried hard enough. She had loved him more than she knew how to say. He had died in a Pennsylvania creek in 1863, and nobody had told her the details, and She had stopped asking because the details had started to feel like something that would finish her off. Now she had the details. Now she had Gideon Cross, who had been at that creek, who had ordered the retreat, whose orders may or may not have been the reason her brother was dead. Now she had an empty bed where her daughter should be sleeping. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. A knock at the door. Soft, Mrs. Thorne, Ben's voice. "I've got something for you." She didn't answer. "I'll leave it here in the hall," he said. "You can take it when you're ready." His footsteps moved away. She sat for another hour. Eventually, she unlocked the door. In the hall, on the floor, was a tin mug of tea gone lukewarm, and beside it, a bundle wrapped in cloth. She picked up the bundle and brought it inside and set it on the bed. Inside were two things: a stack of journals, small, leather-bound, the leather worn down at the corners from being handled. The handwriting on the first page was Gideon's, close and careful, and a stack of letters, still sealed, most of them, addressed in the same handwriting to a G cross, returned unopened. The return address on each one was a string of military forwarding stations, letters that had chased a man through a war and never found him. She opened the first journal. She read for 2 hours. She was not a fast reader when the words mattered. She went slowly, rereading paragraphs, making herself understand each thing before moving to the next. The journals covered 18 months, from the autumn of 1862 through the spring of 1864. Gideon wrote the way he talked, plain and without decoration, and what he wrote about was the war and the men under his command and the particular weight of being responsible for other people's lives in conditions designed to make responsibility impossible. Millbrook Creek was in the fourth journal. June 14th, 1863. She read it 3 times. The order had come from General Harwick at 5 in the morning. Advance across the creek and hold the eastern bank. Gideon had written his objections in full. The eastern bank was exposed on 3 sides. The creek crossing was shallow but wide. There was no cover. To advance was to put 60 men in an open field in front of Confederate artillery. Harwick had repeated the order. Gideon had looked at his men in the pre-dawn dark and made a decision that ended his military career and saved most of their lives. He had ordered a tactical retreat to the tree line. In the confusion of the retreat, 11 men at the far end of the formation had not received the order in time. They had already begun crossing the creek. He had gone back. He had gone back into the crossing himself, on foot, and he had pulled 4 men out before the artillery found the range. He had taken a bullet near his heart on the 3rd return. The regimental surgeon had said afterward that the ball had missed the heart by less than an inch. He had been trying to reach 1 more man when they'd pulled him out. The name in the journal was Thomas Aldrich. I could not get to him in time. I have written that sentence 14 times, and it doesn't get easier or truer. I made the best decision I could with the information I had, and I would make it again because 56 men came home who would not have otherwise. But Thomas Aldrich was 22 years old, and he had a sister back in Philadelphia, and I had already promised him I would look after her if anything happened. And I broke that promise, and I do not know how to balance that ledger. I am not sure it balances. She set the journal down. She sat very still. The returned letters made sense now. After the war, after he'd resigned his commission, he had written, trying to find her. She had already been married to Julian by then, living under a different name, unreachable. The letters had followed a trail that led nowhere. He had found her eventually, by accident, in a train depot in a blizzard, hauling winter supplies. She thought about the way he'd stepped out of the dark that night. The way he'd said, "Crossed Pines always has a warm hearth for folks who need a home." She had thought it was decency. Reflex, a good man doing what good men do, it was that. It was also a man who had been looking for her for 3 years and understood in the moment he saw her that the search was over. He hadn't told her. She understood why he hadn't told her. He hadn't wanted her gratitude. He hadn't wanted her to feel obligated. He had given her a wage and a locked door, and treated her like a person with her own choices to make, because anything less would have been another form of taking something from her. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up. She unlocked the door and walked down the hall. He was in the main room. Not pacing, not drinking, not doing any of the dramatic things a person in his position might reasonably be doing. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, with a cloth, methodical and quiet, his coat already on. His saddlebag was on the floor, beside the chair. He looked up when she came in. She looked at the saddlebag. "Where are you going?" "To get Cora back." "How?" "However I have to." He turned back to the rifle. His voice was perfectly even. "I know where Vance keeps her. He'll have her at the saloon, in the back, locked but not heavily guarded, because he doesn't think I'll move this fast." He pulled the bolt. "Check the action. I'll go tonight. Lassiter goes around the back. I go through the front. We bring her home. And the legal situation, the warrant, Julian, I'll deal with that after." "You'll be killed," she said, "or arrested. And then we're both gone and Cora has nobody." He set the rifle on the table. He looked at her. She could see it in his face. He knew she'd read the journals. He could see it in hers. He wasn't hiding from it or rushing to explain himself. He just waited. "You tried to save him," she said. "I didn't save him. You went back 3 times." He didn't answer that. "You've been looking for me for 3 years," she said. 2.5. "Gideon." He looked at her. Gray eyes, tired and honest and carrying what they'd always been carrying, and now she knew exactly what it was. "I'm sorry about Thomas," he said. "I will be sorry every day for the rest of my life. I don't ask you to forgive that. I know you don't." She sat down across from him. "I'm not ready to talk about Thomas yet, but I need you to hear me right now." She put her hands flat on the table. "We don't win by letting them destroy us. We win with truth and human dignity. You go in there alone tonight with a rifle. You hand them exactly what they want. A reason to bury us both and keep Cora." He was quiet. "I have a plan," she said. "A real one. But I need you alive and uncaressed to do it." He looked at the saddlebag, then at her. "Tell me the plan," he said. She did. Evie laid it out plain. She sat across from Gideon at the table, with her hands folded and her voice steady. And she told him everything she'd been turning over in her mind since the carriage disappeared into the fog. "Vance's power runs on fear and secrecy," she said. "Take away the secrecy, and the fear has nothing to stand on. We don't need guns. We need witnesses." Gideon listened. He was good at that. "He's been running a loan shark operation out of that saloon for years," she continued. "Immigrant workers, single women passing through, people who can't go to the law because the law is his deputy." She paused. "But they can talk to a federal marshal, and they will if someone stands up first." "Who stands up first?" "We do." She looked at him. "And we're not alone." She had been paying attention since the day she arrived. That was the thing about being invisible, about being dismissed as just a housekeeper, just a woman, just a problem to be managed. People talked around you. They forgot you were listening. She knew which women in Oak Creek avoided the north end of town after dark. She knew which of the Mexican laborers at the mill had been paying Vance 30% interest on loans they couldn't escape. She knew the widow Marsh had lost her property deed to a document she hadn't understood. She was signing. She knew all of it because she had listened. Old Ben walked in from the hallway and pulled out a chair and sat down like he'd been expecting this meeting. "I've been talking to some folks," he said simply. Gideon looked at him. "Been talking to them for a while," Ben said, waiting for the right moment. Lassiter appeared in the doorway behind him and leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and gave one single nod. Gideon looked around the table at all of them. Something shifted in his face, not weakness. The opposite. The look of a man who has spent years believing he has to carry everything alone, suddenly confronted with evidence that he doesn't. "All right," he said. They spent the rest of that day and into the evening planning. Evie wrote out affidavits in careful language, one for each person they intended to contact, tailored to what each person had witnessed and what they could testify to. Ben knew who to carry them to. Lassiter knew the back roads that didn't pass through Vance's sight lines. Gideon sat beside Evie while she wrote, and when she paused, searching for the right legal phrasing, he sometimes offered it. He'd read enough territorial law in his years running crossed pines that he knew more than he'd let on. "You could have been a lawyer," she said once, not looking up from the page. "I could have been a lot of things." He handed her the ink. "Ended up a rancher. Is that a complaint?" He thought about it seriously. "No," he said, "it isn't." By nightfall, Ben was on his way back into town, moving quietly, taking the long route. Lassiter had already gone. That left Gideon and Evie alone in the house for the first time. They sat by the fire, not talking much, not needing to. There was too much between them still to sort through cleanly. Thomas and the creek and the years of looking, and the way all of it had landed here, in this house, in the middle of all this trouble. It wasn't resolved. It wasn't simple, but it was real. And they were both still here. "I'm going to get her back," Gideon said. "I know." Evie looked at the fire. "We're going to get her back." He didn't correct the pronoun. The next morning, Evie rode into town herself. She wore her plainest dress and carried a basket like she was coming for supplies, and she walked past the mill and the dry goods store and stopped at the back door of the laundress on Birch Street. She knocked 3 times. The door opened. Inside were 4 women. She had not been entirely sure they would come. They had, every one of them, and they brought what she'd asked for. Signed statements, dates, amounts. The widow Marsh had the original deed with Vance's fraudulent notation, written right across the back of it in his own hand. Evie looked at those women and felt something she hadn't expected. Not just gratitude. Recognition. Women who had been treated like problems to be managed, who had survived anyway, who were still standing and still angry about it, in the useful, constructive way that anger becomes action. "You understand what this means," she said. "Once we submit these, he'll know it was you. He already knows we exist," the widow Marsh said. She was a small woman with iron gray hair and a jaw like a closed fist. "He's just been counting on us being too afraid to matter." "We're not afraid," said the youngest one, barely 20. "We're tired." Evie nodded. That night, she went back to the saloon. Alone. She had argued with Gideon about this part for 20 minutes, and won on the grounds that a woman browsing the general merchandise next door attracted less attention than Gideon Cross at any hour. She went in through the side entrance off the alley. She had sketched the layout from memory, based on what she'd seen through the windows and what Ben had described, and her memory was good. Vance's office was in the back. The door was unlocked. Men like Vance didn't lock their own offices inside their own buildings because it never occurred to them that anyone would dare. She found the forged warrants in the 3rd drawer. She found the ledgers with the loan records. She found, in a locked box she opened with a hairpin in 40 seconds, a handwritten list of names cross-referenced with payments, dates, and the notation paid in full beside several of them that she knew for a fact had never been settled. She was copying the last page when the back door opened. A hired gun. Young, he saw her and reached for his belt. She was already moving. She went out the window she'd left unlatched when she came in, dropped 4 feet into the alley, hit the ground running, and didn't stop. Behind her, she heard shouting. Boots on the boardwalk. She cut left behind the feed store, right through the gap in the fence she'd noted on the way in, and she rode hard the 4 miles home on Dolly, who ran like she understood the stakes. She came through the gate, breathing hard, the copied pages folded inside her coat, against her chest, her heart still hammering. Gideon was on the porch, looked at her face, then at the horse, then at her coat. "Did you get it?" She pulled the pages out. He exhaled. "Tomorrow," she said. "We end this tomorrow." They set out before dawn. Gideon had sent word to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne 3 days earlier, the same night they'd made the plan. The message had gone with a rider Ben trusted, a former cavalry courier who knew the mountain route. They had no way of knowing if it had arrived, or if the marshals were coming, or when they were going anyway. The pass through Blackwood Canyon was the only way to reach the county seat without going back through Oak Creek, and the county seat was where the federal circuit judge was expected within the week. If they could get there, if Evie could present the affidavits and the forged warrants and the ledgers in person with witnesses, the case against her collapsed, and the case against Vance began. Vance knew that, too. They were 2 miles into the canyon when the riders appeared on the ridge above them. Gideon saw them first. He put up one hand and everyone stopped. The canyon walls rose steep on both sides, red rock striped with snow, narrow enough that sound moved strangely through it. Lassiter read the ridge line and held up 4 fingers. Then 2 more. 6 total. Then the shot came. It took Gideon in the shoulder and knocked him sideways in the saddle. He stayed on. He wheeled the horse toward the canyon wall and got behind a boulder the size of a hay wagon, and everyone moved fast. Horses and people scrambling for cover as the second and third shots cracked off the rock above them. Evie pulled Dolly behind a pine stand and got down. She had the rifle. She'd ridden out with it, across her back every morning, for 3 weeks, every session at the fence posts, coming back to her now. Breathe, seat the stock, don't grip too hard. She could see 2 of Vance's men on the low ridge to her left. She could hear Julian's voice somewhere above, directing people, and the sound of it made her jaw tighten in a way that was useful, rather than paralyzing. Old Ben had taken cover with the wagon, which carried the documents wrapped in oilcloth. Lassiter was already moving through the scrub on the canyon floor, circling, doing what Lassiter did, without anyone needing to ask him. Gideon was shooting with his left hand, his right arm close against his body. He was accurate even so. She watched him place 2 shots that bought them 30 seconds of silence. Then she heard Cora. The sound came from the far end of the canyon. A small, high voice carrying through the cold air. Cora was there. Vance had brought her as leverage, and she was in the second carriage, sitting behind the main group of riders. And when Evie understood that, she stopped feeling afraid. Julian appeared on the near ridge. He picked his way down the rock toward Gideon's position, like a man confident that being well-dressed would protect him, and he leveled his revolver at Gideon's back. Gideon didn't see him. Evie did. She stood up. Her hands shook. She was not going to pretend they didn't. She'd read about heroes whose hands were steady at moments like this, and she didn't believe it anymore. Her hands shook and her shoulder ached, and she had 7 weeks of practice against fence posts and exactly no experience with this. She took a breath. She aimed for his gun hand, the way Gideon had taught her, because you aim for what you need to stop, and what she needed to stop was that gun. She squeezed. The rifle cracked, and Julian screamed, and the revolver went spinning off the rock and landed in the snow 12 feet below him, and Julian grabbed his hand and stared at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Surprise, real surprise, the kind that comes from underestimating someone for so long that reality becomes a shock. She leveled the rifle at his chest. "I don't belong to any man," she said. Her voice was clear, loud enough to carry. "I belong to myself, and my daughter belongs to love, not your dirty money." Julian opened his mouth. He didn't get a chance to use it. The sound came from the east end of the canyon first. Hoofbeats, organized and fast, and then the blue coats appeared, coming around the bend. 6 federal marshals, riding hard with their badges, catching what light there was in the gray canyon morning. Old Ben had a way of looking unsurprised by things. He looked unsurprised now. Vance's hired guns saw the marshals and made their calculations quickly. 3 of them threw down their weapons. 2 tried to ride for the west end of the canyon and ran directly into Lassiter, who had gotten behind them during the shooting and was now blocking the exit on horseback, with a patience that was almost admirable. The lead marshal pulled up near Gideon and took in the scene. He looked at the forged warrants. Evie pressed into his hands. He looked at the affidavits, the ledger copies, the deed with Vance's notation on the back. He looked at Gator Vance, who had gone a color that didn't have a clean name. Montgomery Vance, the marshal said. You're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and extortion, and we're going to want to talk about some other things too. Vance said nothing. Julian was sitting in the snow, holding his gun hand, and the deputy who had served the fraudulent warrant at Crossed Pines 2 weeks ago came forward now, with his hands already raised, and said he'd like to make a statement, please, and had been wanting to make one for some time. Evie was already running. Cora was out of the carriage and running toward her across the snow, and Evie caught her and went down to her knees in the cold and held her daughter against her chest so tightly that Cora made a small, indignant sound and said, "Mommy, too tight." "Too bad," Evie said. She held on. Gideon came up beside her. He was pale from the shoulder and moving carefully, but he was on his feet, and his eyes were clear. He looked down at the two of them in the snow and said nothing. Cora looked up at him from the circle of Evie's arms. "You got a owie," Cora said, pointing at his shoulder. "Little one," he agreed. "Ben can fix it." "Ben usually can," he said. Cora considered him. Then she reached out and took hold of two of his fingers with her small hand and held on. And Gideon stood very still, like a man who had been handed something breakable and was determined not to drop it. Evie looked up at him. He looked down at her. In the canyon around them, there was noise and movement, and the cold business of justice being sorted out. But right here, just for a moment, there was only the three of them. That was enough. Spring came to Crossed Pines in stages. First, the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, leaving the dark earth underneath, wet and rich, and smelling like everything starting over. Then the creek unfroze and ran fast and loud for 2 weeks. Then the wildflowers came up in the grass, along the fence lines, yellow and white, and a particular shade of blue that didn't have a name Evie knew. By April, the whole valley was green. The Federal Circuit Court had convened in February, 2 weeks after Blackwood Canyon. Evie had stood before the judge with her affidavits and her ledger copies, and the testimony of the widow Marsh and 4 other women, and she had presented her case with the same clear, level voice she'd used on Gator Vance in the yard at Crossed Pines. The judge had listened, actually listened, the way judges sometimes did when the evidence was so clean and the wrongdoing so thoroughly documented that there was nothing useful to do but pay attention. All warrants against Genevieve Thorne were dismissed. Full, permanent, unassailable custody of Cora Elaine Thorne was granted to her mother. The language in the ruling was specific. No further claim could be filed by the Thorne family of Pennsylvania in any territory or state without meeting a burden of proof that the existing evidence made impossible. Julian had taken a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Vance. He would not be returning west. Vance had not taken a plea agreement. He was awaiting trial. Evie had read the ruling 3 times in the courtroom, and then folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and said, "Thank you," to the judge in a voice that was entirely steady, and then she had walked outside into the February cold and sat down on the courthouse steps and cried for about 4 minutes, which she felt was appropriate. Gideon had sat beside her on the steps and waited. When she was done, he handed her his handkerchief. "Good ruling," he said. "Yes," she said. "You wrote half the legal argument yourself." "Someone taught me the territorial statutes," she said. He said nothing, but there was something in his expression that she was getting better at reading. Satisfaction, quiet and genuine, the kind that doesn't need anyone to notice it. By March, the shoulder had healed well enough that he was back to full work on the ranch. By April, with the spring hiring, Crossed Pines had taken on 4 new hands. Gideon had also quietly expanded the bunkhouse and added 2 small rooms off the south side of the main structure. Good rooms. Private, with proper doors and locks on the inside. 3 women had come to stay in those rooms by May. 1 had been on her way through Oak Creek with nowhere to go. 2 had been working in a town 40 miles east under conditions that didn't suit the word working. Evie had found out about them through the Widow Marsh's network, which had grown substantially since the trial. She had ridden out herself to ask if they'd like a different situation. They had. Gideon hadn't said a word about the new rooms, or the new residents, or the extra cost to the household. He'd just added a third chicken to the yard and told Lassiter to put up another fence section before the summer. He was like that. Evie had learned to read his language by now. Not words. Actions. The way he rebuilt rather than remarked. The way he extended without announcing. She had spent 2 years in a house where every good thing came wrapped in an expectation. And she had gotten so used to that weight that its absence still surprised her sometimes. Thomas was between them, still, would always be, in some way. She had talked about it with Gideon once, at length, in the kitchen, one evening in March, while Cora slept, and the fire burned low. She had said the things she needed to say, and he had heard them without defending himself. And then she had said that she understood what he had done at the creek, and why, and that her brother would have understood it, too. Because Thomas had always been able to tell the difference between a man doing right and a man doing easy. He gave me his watch, Gideon said, before he stopped. Started again, he said. Find Evie, that was all. Just find Evie. She had sat with that for a while. You found me, she said. In a blizzard, he said. At a train depot. Thomas would have found that funny. He thought about it. Yeah, he said. He would have. That had been something. Not resolution. Exactly. More like the grief finding its right shape. Something she could carry without it breaking her. The wedding was on a Saturday in May. No one had discussed it at length. Gideon had asked her one morning in April, while they were both working in the yard, said it plain the way he said everything. Asked if she thought she might want to, when she was ready, if she ever was. He was clear that it was a question and not a plan, that her answer was her own to give. She had thought about it for 3 days. Then she had said, yes. It was small, the front porch of crossed pines, with the valley green and wide behind it. Old Ben stood up with them. The widow Marsh came with the other women from town. Lassiter was there, which meant everyone important was there. A circuit preacher said the words. Evie wore a blue dress she'd made herself from material she'd ordered in February, when she'd still been telling herself she was just being practical, just planning ahead. Gideon wore his good coat and had combed his hair, and looked so uncomfortable about it that she had laughed when she first saw him, and he had looked relieved, because her laughing meant she wasn't nervous, and he cared more about that than he would ever say out loud. When the preacher finished, Cora, who had been standing beside Evie, holding a fistful of wildflowers, with great seriousness, abandoned her post. She ran across the porch and launched herself at Gideon with full confidence that he would catch her, which he did, one arm looping around her, while Evie watched her daughter's face tipped up to his, and the words she'd been testing out all week fell out of Cora's mouth like it had always been there. Papa, Gideon went very still. Then his face did something she had never seen it do before. It opened up, completely, and without reservation, the way a person looks when they have stopped bracing for the thing they've been afraid to want. He held Cora against his chest and looked at Evie. She stepped into the arm he opened for her, and he held them both, and the valley stretched out behind them, green and wide and entirely real. A real home isn't bought with contracts or forced promises, he said. He said it quietly. Just for her, just for Cora. It's built from healed wounds, the right to live as free human beings, and a love strong enough to ride through the darkest night. She listened to his heart beating steady under her ear. Ben was already back inside, starting supper. Lassiter was leaning against the fence post, looking at the mountains. The widow Marsh was talking to one of the new women about the garden, about what to plant, about how the soil here was good once you knew how to work it. Cora pulled back and looked at both of them. Can I feed Dolly now? She asked. After supper, Gideon said. You always say after supper, because you always ask before supper. Cora considered this logic with the full gravity it deserved, then wriggled down and ran off toward the barn anyway, to at least look at the horse. and Evie watched her go with the particular feeling of watching someone be completely and entirely safe. She turned her face up to the sun. Wyoming in May. Wildflowers along the fence. Her daughter's laugh carrying across the yard. Gideon's hand steady in hers. She breathed in. She was home. This story isn't really about a cowboy saving a woman in a blizzard. That's just where it starts. What it's actually about is something much harder and much more worth talking about: the idea that human dignity is not something you earn or beg for. It's something you already have. And the whole battle, from that frozen train platform to the gunfight in Blackwood Canyon, is really just the story of two broken people refusing to let the world talk them out of that truth. Evie could have accepted Vance's offer at the depot. She had 1.8 in her pocket, a 3-year-old on her hip, and nowhere to go in an 11-degree blizzard. Nobody would have blamed her for giving in. But she didn't, because she understood, even in that moment, that once you let someone put a price on your freedom, you spend the rest of your life paying it. So she stood her ground. Not because she was fearless, she was terrified, but because the alternative was worse than the fear. That's not heroism as a superpower. That's heroism as a choice. A quiet, daily, exhausting choice that most of us recognize because we've had to make some version of it ourselves. And Gideon. Here's a man who made the right decision at Millbrook Creek, a decision that saved 56 lives and has been punishing himself for the 11 he couldn't save ever since. He carried that weight alone for years, he thought. Carrying it alone was the honorable thing to do. What the story teaches him, what Evie and Cora teach him, without even trying, is that suffering in silence isn't strength. Real strength is letting good people stand beside you. Real strength is accepting that you are not the sum of your worst moment. It's one of the hardest lessons there is, and most of us are somewhere in the middle of learning it right now. There's also something worth noticing about how justice gets done in this story. It doesn't come from one hero with a fast draw and a white hat. It comes from a community. It comes from the widow Marsh and her signed deed. It comes from women who were tired of being afraid. It comes from old Ben quietly talking to folks for months, waiting for the right moment. It comes from Evie spending 2 sleepless nights at a kitchen table, writing contracts and affidavits in careful, precise language, using knowledge that nobody ever thought to take from her because nobody thought it mattered. Power isn't always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it's the most patient. That's the lesson I keep coming back to with stories like this one. Not that good always wins history is pretty clear that it doesn't, not automatically. But that good, organized, persistent, and unafraid to ask for help gives itself a real fighting chance. Evie didn't defeat Vance with a single dramatic moment. She built a case, brick by brick, document by document, person by person, until the structure of his corruption had nowhere left to hide. That's how real change works. It's slower and less cinematic than we'd like. But it lasts. And at the end of it all, there's a little girl calling a scarred, quiet rancher papa on a sunny porch in Wyoming, and 2 people who came to each other, broken, standing together whole. Not because their wounds disappeared. Because they stopped pretending the wounds weren't there. That's what a real home is. Not a place you arrive at. A thing you build, with the right people, out of honesty and time, and the willingness to stay when it gets hard. Thank you for spending this time with Evie, Gideon, and little Cora. If their story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And we'll see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and do not represent any real persons or historical situations.